So today I want to talk about one of my all-time favorite books about Marxism. And actually, this was really the first book I ever read about Karl Marx and has been a major influence on the way that I think of Marx as a philosopher. Was very influential in the way that I have read different Marxist texts that I've covered on this channel. And that book is Marx's Concept of Man. This came out in 1960 and was written by the German-American social psychologist Erich Fromm. Now, Fromm himself is typically not regarded a Marxist per se. I've seen him described as Marxian, but it's actually one of the books that I feel like I recommend to people quite a lot. And so what I would like to talk about is sort of what sets this book apart from other texts about Marxism, which has a lot to do with Fromm's particular framework through which he's viewing Marx. And I would also like to talk about who I would recommend this book to maybe most highly, because I do feel like there is a particular target audience that Fromm was trying to reach at the time, and I think it would still be applicable for this book to reach today. So to begin with, when Fromm titles his book Marx's Concept of Man, what he's trying to draw out of Marx's philosophy is a philosophy of the human being. What does it really mean to be human? What are humans? And focusing in particular on humans in terms of what they can do and what they can become. And so Fromm is kind of steeped in the Marxist humanist tradition. Marxist humanism, being derived from humanism, which is, at its simplest, is just this idea that human beings are capable of improving themselves. We are capable of improving the world. We can become better, and we should orient our thoughts and our plans and our actions around that idea. We should strive to make the world even more conducive to improving ourselves, improving the way that we live, the way we relate to one another. To be a Marxist humanist, again, at its most simple, would be to say that out of Marx's philosophy, we can not only extract humanism, but perhaps we can even extract a particular means by which humanism can be more fully realized. Now, this is not uncontroversial. One of the biggest criticisms I think that people would probably raise against Marxist humanism would be that it kind of takes a little bit of the teeth out of Marx's more overtly political thinking and possibly even more militant expressions of his thinking that came maybe later in his career. And that's another thing, is that people like Fromm and people of the sort of Marxist humanist ilk tend to focus on maybe some earlier writings of Marx. Fromm hopes to extract a kind of humanism from Marx and a particular conception of what it means to be a human being. And really the tagline of that would be that human beings are creatures that are, yes, subject to influences from their environment, but are also very capable of not only getting a better understanding of that environment and the way that they relate to it, but also, in theory, being able to gain mastery over it. And so that's something that really interests and excites a guy like Fromm reading Karl Marx. So that is really what Fromm has in mind with Marx's concept of man. He wants to extract a particular sketch of the human being such that that human being is free in a very meaningful sense, free not entirely from social constraints and environmental influences and all that fun stuff, but also free to rise above that sort of thing. And if you are familiar at all with my Theses on Feuerbach videos that I did a few years ago, you've probably heard this before. I owe a lot of that to Fromm. I think Fromm being sort of my introduction to Marxism probably had a big influence and continues to have a big influence on the way that I think about Marx himself. I think the context that this book was written in is really important to understanding it. So it came out in 1960, and what was going on in the world then? Well, one thing that was going on was the Cold War. So relations between the US and the USSR, not terribly good, and Americans' perception of communism and by extension Marxism also pretty bad. Fromm was kind of trying to cut between these two perspectives because he didn't think that Americans really understood much at all about what Karl Marx himself thought, but he kind of also felt the same way about the Soviets. Fromm was very anti-Stalinist. He did not think that the Soviets were, that what was set up in the Soviet Union was really a good representation of what Marx's philosophy could be when put into practice. He laid some of the blame on the Americans, he laid some of the blame on the Soviets. Basically, he thought there are a lot of people who are not being very good, like intellectual ambassadors on Marx's behalf. That would be the Soviets. And then he's kind of like, there's people that aren't really exposed to Marx and possibly may not even really seriously want to. That would be the Americans. But Fromm's target audience, I think, was people that were curious. Were like, I've heard about this Marx guy. Seems kind of important, but I hear all these really bad things said about him, and I see all these, terrible things going on in the world that are ostensibly somehow connected to him, but I'm not really sure how they're connected or what. So I'm really confused, but I'm curious. Those are the readers that Fromm is trying to reach. I would say it is a good introduction to Marxist philosophy, but it is an introduction with a bend to it. Just a couple of years before Marx's Concept of Man came out, we saw the first English translation of the 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts by Marx. The most famous of those is arguably his essay on estranged labor or alienated labor, depending on what translation you're reading. This is important because, and I think I've talked about this quite a lot in my Theses on Feuerbach videos, is that this early phase of Marx's writing is not without good reason sometimes called his more philosophical period. This is prior to the Communist Manifesto. This is when Marx is kind of still working on shaping up his own thinking. So it's sort of like he's still kind of, it's experimental in some ways, very experimental in many regards, like experimental in style. He's still sort of like playing the Hegelianese route as far as the way he writes at that point in many of his writings from that period. But more importantly, he's focusing on the kind of things that a quote-unquote Marxist humanist would find interesting, namely the way in which Marx figures capitalism to work against, really humans reaching their full potential as humans. And this is something that's going to be very interesting to someone like Fromm, because this is like his whole thing that he cares about. He's written a lot of great books. I'm a big fan of Erich Fromm, and if you're familiar at all with some of his other works, that probably is not a surprise to hear, that this is what he's pulling from Marx, and this is what's sort of exciting him about Marx. It's easy for us to take for granted that, maybe we assume that these things like, alienation, things like that have always been a big part of the discourse around Marxism, but this is just not the case. And again, this might vary from one region of the world to another, but I think it's important to know that no, this was not always as big a part of the Marxist discourse as it might be today. And this is in no small part due to the fact that the history of translations of Marxist works is kind of bumpy, and extra bumpy because, a lot of the stuff that Marx wrote wasn't even published during his lifetime. The 1844 manuscripts, for example. So it's like not only were these not published when he was alive, but they weren't always published in, every language all at the same time. But so the fact that Fromm in Marx's concept of man is drawing on sources that at the time were really just starting to become part of the conversation is important to keep in mind. So that's kind of what sets this book apart, is that Fromm is really trying to focus on combating what he would consider myths and misconceptions about what Marx believed, coming from the American side and from the Soviet side at the time. And he's also trying to really extract ideas that would be interesting to a humanist, ideas about human potential and human creativity and, the capacities that humans have to understand and master the world around them without setting aside completely the idea that to a meaningful extent we are also influenced by the world we live in. So it's not some kind of like vulgar individualism. It's not existentialism. It is Fromm, and Fromm is kind of like his own thing. I should probably do more videos on Fromm in general because he's just so awesome. So who would I recommend this book to? I would recommend this to anyone who is not at all familiar with Marx. I do think it is a good introduction to his philosophy, even if it is a bit not slanted towards something too terrible. I mean, there's much worse slants you can get than a humanist slant, but a slanted one nonetheless, and an introduction that is maybe more confined to a particular era of Marx's thought, so it wouldn't be like a complete picture. It's not going to be like a Marxism 101, but it's going to be really kind of think of it as like a monograph on a particular period of Marx's thinking. And Fromm does get into like the more like overtly political aspects of Marx's philosophy too in the book. I don't want to say it's like just 100% all about the 1844 manuscripts, but those are texts that he is drawing very heavily on in the book. If you're interested in checking this book out, you can read the entire thing for free. It's on the Marxist Internet Archive. It's not a particularly long book, maybe around 100 pages or so, if that. It's a great read. Definitely recommend it. It is a seminal work of Marxist humanism. It is a great introduction to Marxist philosophy, albeit with some, caveats such as, Fromm is coming at it from a particular framework, and with a particular goal in mind. And it's also maybe a great introduction to Marx himself. Till next time, thanks.